faculty, postgraduate student, and our virtual audience who join us this morning. Welcome to our guest lecture, 3-in-1 program, hosted by Soil and Water Management Study Program, Faculty of Agriculture, Universitas Brawijaya. In the spirit of international collaboration and academic excellence, we are honored to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Chris Anderson from Massey University, New Zealand, who will share insight on soil geochemistry, trace element, and environmental risk management, specifically in disturbed landscape. Before we begin, let me run through a few housekeeping items. First, please ensure your mobile phone are switched off or in silent mode. Second, for our virtual attendants, kindly mute your microphone and use a chat box for question, or in a Q&A session, you can ask directly. And the third, at the end of this lecture, we will have a Q&A session. Please raise your hand or use the virtual raise hand function for audience who join us virtually if you wish to ask question. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Kurniawan Sigit Wicaksono to deliver a short welcome address. Please, time is yours.
Oke, terima kasih. Suara saya masuk, Bu Rini?
Masuk, Pak.
Oke. Yang terhormat seluruh mahasiswa peserta kuliah, selamat pagi semuanya. Good morning, good afternoon, especially our honorable guest, Professor Chris Anderson. Okay. It's great pleasure to welcome to our guest lecturer, 3-in-1. I think this lecture is a part of the learning activity for our master program and doctoral program. So we are truly delighted to have Professor Anderson with us today to share his expertise and experience in soil geochemistry and environmental risk management. So we believe this session will broaden our understanding of how trace elements affect soil and ecosystem health, and how we can better manage disturbed land through scientific and sustainable approach. On behalf of the department, I would like to express our gratitude to Professor Anderson for being with us today, and to all participants joining both on site and online. So we hope this lecture will be inspiring, insightful, and encourage collaboration in the field of land and environmental management. Thank you and enjoy the lecture. Saya kembalikan ke Bu Reni. Terima kasih, Bu Reni. Silahkan.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kurniawan Sigit Wicaksono, for the welcoming speech and for all information. This lecture is recorded live in YouTube, so you can watch it later. And now, Chris, time is yours. But before you deliver your lecture, let me read your curriculum vitae for all students. Our guest lecturer today is Professor Chris Anderson. He is professor in Environmental Science, School of Agriculture and Environment, Massey University, New Zealand. He is also a adjunct or visiting professor in Institute of Geochemistry, Chinese Academy of Sciences, Guiyang, China. Also, University of Mataram, Lombok, Indonesia. He is also has many collaboration with Brawijaya University, and his education, he was graduated from Bachelor of Science, Massey University in 1997, and Doctor of Philosophy in 2000. His research and professional profile, Professor Chris Anderson describes himself as a soil chemist with expertise in environmental geochemistry. His major research interests include trace elements in soils, plants, and the soil-plant animal system. Also, phytoremediation and phytomining using plants to extract or immobilize contaminants or metals. Also, rehabilitation of degraded soil, mine, tailings remediation, artisanal and small-scale mining landscape. He has led and contributed to international projects across New Zealand, China, Indonesia, and other countries. Also, for several selected achievement and awards. First, he is the winner of the Guizhou Scientific and Technical Cooperation Awards in China for long-term collaboration with the Institute of Geochemistry, Guizhou Province. Also, he established commercial company for phytomining technology and member of Council of the New Zealand Society of Soil Science. And several publications. You can contact him by email. I will share his email if you are interested in doing research related to his expertise. Okay, without further ado, Professor Chris Anderson, time is yours.
Thank you very much, Renee. Terima kasih. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm always delighted to be able to engage with Universitas Brawijaya. As Renee points out, I have a long history of collaboration that began with Professor Wani Utomo and Eko Handayanto. So I've been very privileged to work with them over a number of years, and then I was very privileged to host Renee in New Zealand. Fond memories of the fact that we had Renee here in New Zealand as the world shut down, and I managed to get Renee on the very last plane out of New Zealand before COVID locked down. So I still remember that chaos of the day of trying to get Renee back to Brawijaya before you could not escape New Zealand. So that just seems like a world ago. I'm very happy for this to be, quite interactive. One of the great things now with Zoom is that I think we're all getting much more used to it. So please, if you have a question, don't be scared to put something into chat. I've got multiple screens going, so I can keep an eye on anything that comes up. And if there's something that's worth exploring, I will. So please do think about this being interactive. There's a title on the screen. So really, just to confirm, you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Cool. It's always good to check this even on Zoom today. So I have got a title here, but probably what's more important is to think about what I was asked to talk about. All right. So if I think about Renee's initial invitation, I had a bit of a brief, and that brief was to talk about soil geochemistry, trace elements, and environmental risk management in disturbed landscapes. Now, there's a lot to consider there. And if I think about what I want to try and get across today from your very kind introduction from Professor Kurniawan, is to inspire perhaps, or to leave you with something to think about. And so in the process of doing that, what I think is quite useful is to think about some of the words. So before I get going into my content, it's perhaps useful to think about some definitions of some of these words on the screen. And I thought a good starting point would be to think about disturbed landscapes. All right, so we've got soil geochemistry, trace elements, environmental risk management, and disturbed landscapes. So we've got a number of subjects here. So what we do these days is we use AI. Okay, this is another major change to the technology that we have available to us in this grand world. We can ask Google, we can ask AI, we can ask ChatGPT what these things are, And this is what is out there. So if I look at what disturbed landscapes are, I get this definition. These are areas where natural or human-caused events have altered the ecosystem composition and structure, affecting functions like biodiversity and resource availability. Now, I think that's very important for us. Now, we're here, you are studying in the master's program in soil and water management and the doctoral program in agricultural science. You're looking at soil conservation, remediation techniques, you're looking at land reclamation. So I think for us, disturbed landscapes are very, very important because these are areas where the environment has been altered and that has affected biodiversity and resource availability. So let's think about Indonesia. I did a little bit more research. And so if we think about disturbed landscapes in Indonesia, and we think about the impact on our ecology and our environmental equilibria, then we can see that disturbed landscapes in Indonesia, the scientific community sees them as being caused by deforestation for agriculture and industry, as well as natural events like volcanic eruptions and fires. And I think that's, again, really important. We certainly know that there's been huge clearance of forestry in Indonesia for agriculture and industry. So that is anthropogenic. That is human-caused, okay? Large-scale agribusiness, pulp and paper production, mining, infrastructure. But there's also that geogenic domain too. So we've got volcanic eruptions and fires. So we've got to think about the two of them. It's not just those effects that we have induced. There's also that effect of natural processes, fires, volcanic eruptions, which have caused land degradation. All right, what about New Zealand? Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today a bit about New Zealand because, you know, that's perhaps more relevant for me is to give you some insight from New Zealand. But believe it or not, we have a lot of disturbed landscapes. And so the internet, AI, scientific literature would tell us that landscapes in New Zealand have been significantly disturbed by activities, primarily human activities, because we don't have the regularity of volcanic eruptions or fires that you have in Indonesia. But we've seen deforestation, intensive agriculture, urbanization, and invasive species. And I think this is the pressing one for New Zealand. So New Zealand's population is growing. Slowly, but it is growing. We still have a fraction of Indonesia. We have perhaps 5.2, 5.3 million people in New Zealand. Okay, that is a very small population relative to Indonesia. But we are seeing is that as our population grows, urban expansion is having an increasing impact on our landscapes. So I think we can see that there's a common theme. All right. Disturbed landscapes is something that is of critical concern to you all studying at Universitas Brawijaya, but it's also critically important for students studying here in New Zealand doing master's programs, doctoral programs. And so that's where we share a lot of common interest. Okay, so there's disturbed landscapes, right? Let's think about soil geochemistry and trace elements. Well, I'm not really going to worry about that because that's what I study. As Rennie kindly pointed out with my CV, I have a long history of working in soil chemistry, soil geochemistry and trace elements. And really, you know, I focus on trace elements, done a lot of work with arsenic, with mercury, cadmium, lead, fluorine. Those are trace elements. And really, geochemistry is what we use to describe their behavior in soil. We look at their solubility, their speciation. We understand whether they're labile or inert. That is geochemistry. So I think we can give that a big tick. We don't have to really explore that part. All right, so let's just take the trace elements and soil geochemistry as what we do. But we've still got one more, environmental risk management. And this is perhaps the most important one. It's in the middle there. And I would argue that all of us today around this lecture, environmental risk management is what we do. Okay, if I think about the courses, the study programs that you're doing, soil conservation, remediation technologies, land reclamation, essentially what you are doing is a domain of environmental risk management. Because what we're trying to do is that we're looking at those impacts. We're looking at our disturbed landscapes. We're thinking about the environment. We're thinking about the risk of negative impact, and we're trying to manage that risk. So that's what we do. We're looking at soil geochemistry trace elements. We're applying that to our disturbed landscapes. But what we're really trying to do is manage environmental risk. But we can actually get some more definition around that. Okay, so let's go back to AI. Environmental risk management is a systematic process to identify, assess, and control potential adverse environmental impacts from human activities. So that's a really important definition. It's systematic. We use science. It's a process that involves evidence. It involves substantiated decisions. We're identifying, we're assessing, we're controlling, and we're looking at potential impacts. Because as a good environmental risk manager, you're trying to identify the harm before it happens, which is what I say should be our task and what we do. So here's my reworked title. All right, so let's build on those definitions. And this is what I'm going to be talking to you about for the next, let's say, 30 to 40 minutes. Happy to take questions as we go. But here's my reworked title: Managing the Risk of Contaminants in Disturbed Soil, a New Zealand Perspective. And my challenge for you as we go through this is to think about my New Zealand perspective and to consider how that is relevant to your study programs and how you can use that New Zealand perspective to help manage the risk of degraded land in Indonesia. Because that's what I'm looking for you to do. I'm looking for you to be the future leaders. That's why I'm very happy to be here today to support the team at UB. It's because I have great hope for your future aspirations as graduate or postgraduate students in the Faculty of Agriculture to be able to engage with us to make some better decisions in the future. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So let's start here. Thinking about the New Zealand perspective, I'm going to think about some of the data, all right, that underpins the trends that I'm seeing in New Zealand. And really, I'm going to talk about the increasing noise around contamination. So the increasing awareness of contamination we see in New Zealand and how that is influencing public behaviour. Now, often, I'm sure some of you have seen something of New Zealand, you've maybe seen movies or you've read about different stories, you've engaged on the internet. But I can tell you that despite the claim that New Zealand is very clean and green, we do have some environmental problems. We have some quite significant environmental problems. Now, I'm not going to focus on all of them today, but here's a classic example. This was last year, just over a year ago. A headline in New Zealand: Waikato River, major river in the North Island of New Zealand. It's probably our longest river in New Zealand, which doesn't say much because New Zealand's quite a long, thin country. But this goes from Lake Taupo in the centre of the North Island. It heads north up towards Auckland, and then it goes out to the west coast. And this is a story. The Waikato River turns bright orange. Council warns of contamination. Now, what happened here is that this was in an area of the river that was going through old mining land. And what had happened is that one of the old adits that had previously been mined for gold had broken open, and it had started to discharge acid water into the river, and that acid water was full of iron. And so what had happened is that there was this massive plume of iron-rich water that had gone into this major New Zealand river, which is a source of drinking water for a large proportion of the population. And this is what gets people worried. Okay, we're not supposed to have metal-contaminated water in New Zealand, and so when something like this happens, there's more pressure on the scientists to explain what is happening. That's the noise that we hear. Recently, again, this came out last year, there was recently published a map of heavy metals across Wellington's soils. So Wellington is the capital of New Zealand. It is at the bottom of the North Island of New Zealand. It is a harbour city. It's quite a small city, population only of about 300,000 people. It sits on a very active fault line, but there was a report of the metal contamination across the urban area. Information, data that is being released to the population, and it's causing people to think about what it means, and it causes people to fear what that contamination might mean for their own personal health. So again, noise, data, information that is getting people thinking about contamination in our disturbed environments. And that relates back to this idea that our urban areas are under increasing expansion, and that is disturbing our landscapes. Here's another story, again, came out last year, and this is a project that I'm kind of actively involved with. This is in another city in New Zealand called New Plymouth. Now, in New Plymouth, we used to make the chemical or the herbicide 2,4,5-T, 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxy, acetic acid. Really nasty chemical. It is now banned. It's a persistent organic pollutant, so it's banned under the Stockholm Convention. But more problematic is that when they manufactured 2,4,5-T, dioxin was an impurity in the manufacturing product. And dioxin is considered to be one of the more toxic chemicals known to mankind. So here's another story. Okay, New Plymouth former chemical plant investigation finds potential for contamination. Again, noise. What does it mean? People are worried. They're concerned about what this might mean for their health, for their children, for their food. So again, we've got these issues. Now, in a lot of my teaching in New Zealand, we look at these case studies, we start to think about what they mean. And one of the points that I like to be very clear on is that we've got to be careful about these two words, contamination and pollution. And the problem is that they're often used interchangeably, and they're often used inappropriately. And so I think if you want to be a very good scientist who is being objective and is using good science to conduct that environmental risk management, which is what we all should be doing, we've got to be very clear about the definitions. Now, contamination has a very sound definition. It is simply the presence of something above a normal level. Okay, and that normal level might be a background level, or it might be an acceptable level. It's what we call normal. And as humans, we spend a lot of time looking at what's normal. Okay, we have normal IQ, normal weight, normal height, normal pips in an orange. There is normal numbers for just about everything, and we have normal numbers for the presence of cadmium in soil. So what we need to think about is the fact is that contamination is just a number. It is the comparison of one number to what is normal. If it's above normal, we could say it's contaminated. If it's below normal, it is not contaminated. What we need to ask ourselves, though, when we find contamination is we have to ask the question, so what? What does that mean? And if we find that that contamination is adversely affecting some aspect of life, in other words, it's bad, then we can say we've got pollution. And pollution is always bad, because pollution means that there is harm, that there is risk of harm that's unacceptable. So somewhere in that continuation. So we've taken contamination and we've confirmed through science that there's a problem, and we define it as pollution. What we've got to realize is that contamination is not necessarily pollution. We can have contamination, and if we use our environmental risk management and see that it's actually not causing harm because no one is exposed to it, then it's just contamination. It is not pollution, and we should perhaps think about leaving it be. And it's a really important lesson as we're going to go through this morning's lecture. Think about what that means for us conducting our environmental risk management. All right, so what defines contamination? All right, so remember, you've got to have contamination. We've got to think about if we find contamination, we've got to think further about pollution. So what defines contamination? And in New Zealand, like in many countries, the answer is regulation. What defines normal? Who says that something is normal? And for New Zealand, it's our Ministry for the Environment. And if we're looking at contaminants in soil, especially if we're looking at trace elements, or we're looking at organochlorines, DDT, dioxin, aldrin, dealdrin, chemicals that we've used over history to kill pests, what we use in New Zealand is something called the National Environmental Standard for Assessing and Managing Contaminants in Soil to Protect Human Health. That is really the final rule set for what is decided to be contamination. But there's a problem with it, because what contaminants, what the NES does, and we can call this the NES, what the NES does is it really thinks about where people are directly engaging with land. What the NES does not cover is agriculture. So what happens is that the NES is used when we want to change land use, or we want to build a house, or we want to build a factory. If we do that in New Zealand, then we have to test the soil, and we use the NES to decide whether our use of that land is going to be safe. It is not part of agriculture, because what happens is that there are no rules really about agricultural land use. We've got a different set of guidelines. Now, in New Zealand, we actually default back to something as early as 2003. NZWWA stands for New Zealand Wastewater Association. There's another set of guidelines, and we've got some values on the screen there. So for cadmium, we've got a rough value of 1 milligram per kilogram for agricultural land. Okay, copper, we've got 100. Nickel, we've got 60. These are not that national standards. These are more informal guideline values. And then what happens is that we can compare those against the New Zealand range. So we automatically already have a problem in New Zealand. We have these national environmental standards, but they don't apply to agriculture. And agriculture is one of the greatest land uses we find in New Zealand. Now we can explore this, right? Here's an example of a degraded area of land. So this is disturbed land in New Zealand. So I've given you a map of New Zealand there, and the white arrow is pointing to an area up in the north part of the North Island. And this is a mountain range, which is very heavily mineralized. Lots of minerals in there. And this is an old mine that used to have lead, zinc, and cadmium. It was mining lead, zinc, and cadmium for a long time, and it was actually closed down because of mercury contamination issues. So we could take a sample of the soil, and those are the numbers in the bottom right in black. Okay, zinc, 2,500 milligrams per kilogram. Chromium's slightly elevated. Cadmium's 26, that's very high. Copper's 3,200. This is really quite nasty material. pH of 3, so a lot of soluble metals, very low organic matter, nothing really grows on it. And if we were to compare those values against these guidelines in New Zealand, let's say we were going to grow plants on it, well, clearly we would not be able to. Okay, zinc, we've got there a soil limit of 200 for agricultural land. This soil, if we want to call it a soil, this substrate is 2,600. So it's really easy to decide. Okay, we've got guideline values. We look at this material. It is clearly contaminated and nothing's growing on it unless we modify the environment significantly. So for those of you that are looking at land reclamation, this is the same sorts of issue you find in Indonesia. We had to add organic matter, we had to add lime to re-establish vegetation. So it's polluted. This is land that's got a big problem. It's contaminated, fits the guideline. We ask ourselves, so what? What's the problem? Well, it's preventing life. It's blowing around. There's a whole lot of exposure pathways. People can be affected. It's polluted. It's bad. So that's an easy example. But here's another one. Okay, I've gone to the top of the South Island here. So here we are in New Zealand, low population density. The big dot for your interest is where I am. So the dot on the map is Palmerston North. That's where I'm sitting right now. It's a very windy day. New Zealand is under a massive storm at the moment. Most aircraft of the country have been grounded because we've got 100-kilometre-an-hour winds blowing around. There's quite a lot of damage happening. So an example of changing climate. So I'm in Palmerston North, but down at the top of the South Island, this is an environment we have. Now, there's something interesting happening here. You can see that between the left and the right-hand side of the landscape, there's a clear difference. There's a fault. So on the right-hand side, we've actually got some deep crustal material that has been upthrust against the bedrock of the normal landscape. And that's what's in the soil. Nickel, 2,500 milligrams per kilogram. Chromium, 3,000 or over 3,000. Zinc's elevated and copper's elevated. So let's compare it. Okay, if we look at that nickel level of 2,500, we compare it back to the soil limit for agricultural land, which is 60. It's clearly contaminated. We could argue it's polluted because look at the vegetation. It's very poor. It's struggling to grow. And if we were to take, if I was to take a sample of that material and was to send it to a laboratory and get them to interpret the data, they would come back to me and tell me this was a highly contaminated site. Where is it? We need to deal with it. But that would be an inappropriate response. This is a completely natural environment. So the vegetation on the right-hand side is an example of the flora we see on ultramafic soils. This is the same material that your team at UB has been looking for in places around the mining in Sulawesi. So some of the nickel mining that has happened around parts of Indonesia. So we've got a completely natural environment that we can say is contaminated, and that from agricultural land use, we could also say is polluted, but there's no point in doing anything about it because actually there's nothing wrong with it. So I would argue in this particular case that yes, it's contaminated, and yes, it's heavily contaminated with nickel and chromium, but in fact, actually, it is not polluted because the ecology has evolved and adapted for this environment for that to be a natural setting. No one's living on it. There's no cattle. There's no sheep. There's no crops. No one's growing tomatoes on that land. You never would. You can't access it. So we can think about what it means in the context of land use. So at the heart of us doing environmental risk assessment, what we've got to be thinking about is exposure pathways. And so if you were studying any of your programs here in New Zealand, this is what you would hear me talking about an awful lot: exposure pathways. And I really like this image, because what this image is showing us is a map from our Ministry for the Environment that talks about the exposure pathways for that red contaminated soil. And if we can understand those exposure pathways, we can think about the contamination that is indicated by that red, and we can then make some commentary or some conclusions around whether it's really pollution. So let's look at the arrows going up from that red land. You can see there's a child there playing in the soil. That's always the biggest problem. Okay, children playing in soil is a massive exposure pathway for contamination to go from the soil into the child. If it's lead, it can affect brain development. If it's cadmium, it can cause cancer. That is pollution. Animals could eat the soil, and we could eat the animals. Vegetables could take up the contaminant from the soil, we eat the vegetables. So in both cases, you can see we've got arrows: direct ingestion, uptake by grazing animals, uptake into food crops. That goes into the food, that comes to us, that's a problem. Let's look at the other ones. Leaching into groundwater. If those contaminants are mobile, they go into groundwater. That groundwater is taken up for drinking water. It is taken up for irrigation water. Again, we're moving those contaminants into us. And if any of those exposure pathways are apparent, then we can say there's pollution. So this is how we delineate between contamination and pollution. Yes, the soil is contaminated, but we've then got to ask ourselves, so what? What is the problem? We're growing vegetables on that soil. The plants are accumulating the contaminant and we're eating the contaminant. That is bad. That is pollution. It's getting into the groundwater. We're using that groundwater for drinking water. That is bad. That is pollution. But we could manage that pollution quite simply by not getting rid of the contamination, but by changing the land use. So if we get into a situation, if I try and be clever here and draw, if we can stop that happening, stop this happening, stop this happening, stop runoff, stop leaching, all of a sudden that contamination is isolated. And if we can isolate that contamination, then all of a sudden we have locked it in place. The exposure pathways have gone. No longer are animals playing with it. No longer are children playing in it. No longer are we growing vegetables on it. No longer is it leaching or running off. It is isolated. Then it can be contaminated, but it's no longer polluted. And that's at the heart of what we do with a lot of our thinking in New Zealand. We think about how we not necessarily can remove the contamination, but we can change the risk profile. And we do that through exposure pathways, because that allows us to work out what is an acceptable use of the land versus what is not acceptable. And that acceptability function is determined by the exposure pathways and risk. I need to use my rubber now. Let's just rub out my marks there. Okay, so what defines pollution? If we bring this to a little bit of a close here, okay, if there is contamination, we've found it, we've then got to look for pollution. And how do we do that? We think about exposure. We look at exposure. We look at how people are engaging with that. Generally, food or direct contact is the objective here, because that allows us to define environmental risk. And remember, I said right at the start, that is what we do. We are here to look at environmental risk management. And what I'd like to say is that contamination is not always bad. Pollution is bad. We must deal with pollution, but we don't have to necessarily worry about contamination. And that's at the heart of driving what we do from an environmental practice. Right, so let's come back to New Zealand. I'll give you a couple of case studies, give you some examples, and then we can think about what this all means. All right, so I mentioned before, New Zealand, despite this image of being clean and green, we do have issues with contamination and pollution. And one of the big problems we have is lead. So we have a lot of lead in our urban environment, and that's primarily from roofing material and from paint. And so that picture on the left there is lead on a roof, because we commonly use lead because it's very soft, it's malleable and ductile, because we can beat it into shape, and it doesn't really degrade particularly quickly. We use it to seal areas where water can come into our houses, because we have a lot of rain in New Zealand. So we have a lot of lead in our urban environment through roofing material, but also through paint. Through a long part of New Zealand's history, we used lead-based paint. It's a problem throughout the world. I'm sure you've got the same problem in Indonesia. But we find that there's a lot of lead in our environment because we used to paint our wooden houses with lead-based paint. And over time, people scrape the paint off and then repaint. And if you scrape the paint off and let it fall into your garden, you're building up lead in your garden. Now we ask ourselves, okay, is this a problem? Is there any exposure pathways? Is there risk? Well, if you've got lead in your garden and you grow vegetables in it or your children play in it, clearly there's going to be a problem because you've got an exposure pathway. But we also, interestingly, see this with our wildlife. So this is a really interesting example about how we are trying to improve our biodiversity. So this here is one of New Zealand's native parrots. So this is a bird called a kaka, and it lives in the North Island primarily. There's a lot of kaka in Wellington. Remember I showed you that picture before about a map of urban contamination in Wellington? And what has been happening is that these birds are really strong and they rip at lead fleshings on roof. And so there's some really interesting data coming through where these birds are ingesting a large amount of lead metal and they're getting brain damage. So there's quite significant poisoning of these animals because of our use of lead on roofs. So we've got an exposure pathway and we've got to think about how we manage and deal with that. But more importantly, we have a lot of lead in soil. So let's go and look at this Wellington report. Okay, this is the Wellington area. And you can see there the colours, and I've shared these slides with Rennie, so you're very welcome to access the PDF version of these slides. I sent these to Rennie last night, so please feel free, Rennie, to share the slides. But this is a map here that looks at Wellington City, and we can see the colour contours of lead. And so, 82 to 629, that's the highest bracket and the darkest colour. And we can see that there's quite a lot of lead there, right? Let's look at the NES. I mentioned the NES. This is what defines contamination in New Zealand. And if we think about rural residential and residential, the limits are 160 to 210. Well, clearly, some of those dark blue colours in our urban environment are now above the urban safe limit for lead in soils. Now, I've done some work in Palmerston North. I've had students over time looking at our soils in the city of Palmerston North. I'd love to do this work in Malang. I think this would be fascinating work to be doing in the urban environment in your city. But here's one study. This was a master's study, and we sampled collected 316 soil samples from across 34 individual houses in Palmerston North, and this is what we found. We found a range of lead in soil from 11.5 milligrams per kilogram to nearly 10,000, nearly 1% lead in soil. And remember, this is soil adjacent to people's houses. Okay, so this is in New Zealand, rural New Zealand. We've got 10,000 milligrams per kilogram lead in soil. Now, we estimate that there's maybe over 500,000 New Zealand homes in New Zealand that are a source for lead. And that's potentially 25% of New Zealand's homes. So what are we going to do? This is a massive problem. Okay, soil conservation, remediation techniques, land reclamation. This is a massive problem from the perspective of disturbed landscapes. So we need to be clever. Now, we can't remove that lead. It's just not going to work. 10,000 milligrams per kilogram of lead. The only way you're going to deal with that is to dig it up and take it somewhere. Well, where do you put it? So we've got to be very clever. We've got to go back and think about the exposure pathways, think about what people are doing in that soil, and, put grass on it, plant roses in it, stop people playing in it, stop people growing vegetables in it, making very good decisions about what we do that is unique to each site. So what we're doing is we're thinking about risk at each soil. Now, there's also emerging contaminants. All right, I'm not going to get into these, but, more and more we're talking in New Zealand about things like PFAS. Okay, everybody talks about PFAS now. I've just heard this morning of a study looking at trout, which is a freshwater fish from the Waikato River again. Apparently, the PFAS levels in trout are off the scale. In eels, they're off the scale. People have started looking and found vast amounts of these contaminants. Microplastics. Currently got a PhD student that's looking at microplastics in horticultural soils because we use a lot of plastic mulch. What is the impact of those contaminants having on our broader system? And what we find is that when we're trying to make compost, organic waste, we find a huge amount of contaminant input from PFAS and microplastics into our organic compost, which then means that have we got concerns? Is the fear about the safety of products made from organic waste? So these contamination issues start to broaden out. So if we're going to do this, comes back to that risk exposure pathway matrix. If we are going to be clever and we're going to do our job as environmental risk managers, we need to think about this. We've got to think about what is a real risk, what is, as opposed to what is a perceived risk, perceived versus actual risk. And that comes down to our exposure pathways, contamination, and pollution. That is what we need to be doing as environmental scientists. So what's driving these issues? Okay, I've kind of mentioned on some of these, land use change. One of the biggest challenges we have in New Zealand is around our land use change. Urbanisation, right back at the start, one of the big drivers for land disturbance or disturbed land is the development of our urban areas, where we're changing from food production or agricultural land use into housing, which is under the NES. So land use change is a big driver for issues in New Zealand, and I'm sure it's a driver for issues in Indonesia. And accompanying that is a lack of understanding, misinformation, and disinformation, because let's face it, this is complicated. You guys are doing your master's and PhD on the subject. Understanding the science is really important. Being able to communicate effectively is important. And then what it really draws down to is access for markets. So let's have a look at some of these. But as I've said, land use change, this is the really big problem. This is what gives us a lot of cause of concern in New Zealand. And it's because agricultural land is not subject to our national regulations. Agricultural land is not subject to our national environmental standards for protecting human health. And here's an example. Okay, this is a piece of agricultural land. This is what New Zealand's agricultural land looks like, a bit different to parts of Indonesia. This is a site on the east coast of the North Island, and I had a PhD student looking at it. This was actually an old dipping site for sheep, because we used to dip sheep, and what that means is bath them. So we'd take sheep and put them in a bath of arsenic, basically. And the aim was that the arsenic would kill the pests, fleas, ticks, lice on the sheep. And it meant that the sheep were free of those sorts of pests. But the problem is that these areas build up contamination. And so we mapped arsenic at the site, and we found a very high level of arsenic at 15 to 30 centimetres depth, 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. Even on the surface, there's still 334. Let's look at the NES. Okay, if you wanted to take this land and build a house on it, what we find is that we couldn't. So the legislation would prohibit our ability to change this from agriculture into urban development. Because for rural residential, the maximum permissible level of arsenic in soil is 20 milligrams per kilogram. Even if you wanted to build a factory on it, you can't, because the commercial industrial limit is 70. So while this is fine as agricultural land, no one's going to do anything about it. The problem is if we change it to another land use. And in New Zealand, where we are changing our land use from agricultural to urban development, that is causing us problem because contamination is impacting on how we can use land. We have a big problem in New Zealand also with cadmium. We have been very dependent in New Zealand on using phosphate fertilizers. Okay, I could give a whole lecture on why we use phosphate fertilizers in New Zealand, but that's for the soil science study program, looking at fertility. But we have used a lot of phosphate fertilizer, and because of where we got our phosphate fertilizer from, we have a lot of cadmium in our soil. So unfortunately, New Zealand used the most cadmium contaminated phosphate fertilizer in the world for a long period of time. So we have issues with cadmium. Now, again, this is not controlled by the NES. This is controlled by food policy that tries to prevent excessive buildup of cadmium in soil. And we have something called a tiered fertilizer management system. So this is where the environmental risk management has started to put limitations on what we can do with fertilizer. And what we do in New Zealand is we break soil down into five different tiers of cadmium concentration. Okay, less than 0.6 milligrams per kilogram cadmium, no problem. Greater than 1.8 milligrams per kilogram, big problem. And you can see there that if we have got land, agricultural land, that is more than 1.8 milligrams per kilogram cadmium, we can got some serious limitations on what we can apply to that land, because we can't apply any fertilizer to it that is going to add more cadmium, and that means we can't add any phosphate fertilizer. So what we do is that we don't have an NES problem there, but we are worried about the continual build-up into food, and so we try and manage it through fertilizer management practices. Now, I had a PhD student a number of years ago that mapped a farm in the Waikato. So we looked at a farm that was a dairy farm that had a long history of fertilizer application. And what we are seeing is we've got transects across individual paddocks on the farm. And if we think about where those values on the left, okay, starting from next to no cadmium right up to those dark orange samples, which are getting up towards that top tier of the tiered fertilizer management scheme, what we need to do is think about how that relates to the NES. And so again, if we were in a situation where we were going to sell this property and we wanted to take this block of land here, which is going to be sitting somewhere around here, all right, so we've got some quite large or quite high concentration of cadmium, and let's say we're going to sell this farm and we want to build a rural residential development on it, we can't. Because that land, if we want to sell it and redevelop it, we'll have to go through what we call in New Zealand a consent. And the consent process will check the cadmium and other contaminants according to the NES. That land would fail the consent because it has more than 0.8 milligrams per kilogram cadmium in it. that is a problem. So if you've sold your farm and have invested $1 million into developing it, you might find out that in fact you can't, and you've lost all of your money. So we have this problem. Under agriculture, there's no issue. But if we change that land use and we move to a development, then the regulations would say that there's going to be issues. So this is the issue we face in New Zealand. And I'd be really interested to know if this is where some of the policy regulation is going in Indonesia. It is the biggest problem we have. The reason we don't apply the NES to agricultural land is that we're testing for the food. Okay, because what happens in New Zealand is that we test the food, we make sure that our food is not exceeding requirements for our export markets. Now that does happen every so often. I've heard recently avocados. We've exported avocados to Korea and they've exceeded the cadmium threshold and the shipment's been sent back. So we have to be very careful there around the quality and the safety of our food, but in all reality, it's a perceived risk, not an actual risk, but it's a part of a trade constraint. So we've got to be aware of this. We need to make decisions about what we're doing. Now, it gets problematic. DDT. We haven't used DDT for about 40 years in New Zealand. Another commonly used pesticide. We assume it's breaking down in our soil, but is it? Well, this is where our environmental risk assessment comes really complicated. Now, this is a fairly complicated graph, but I think it shows a really good picture. Okay, so this is some work, again, that was done in New Zealand, a colleague of mine down at the University of Canterbury. And what it's doing is it's looking at the DDE to DDT ratio. So what happens is that if we've got DDT in soil, it breaks down. It goes to DDE, then it goes to DDD, and it becomes progressively less toxic. What this graph is looking at is the ratio, and we want a high ratio, because a high ratio means we've got more breakdown product than primary DDT. So we want a high ratio, but it's plotting that ratio against the copper concentration in soil. It's a log scale to make it work, but what we can see is that as the copper concentration in soil increases, that ratio decreases. And a ratio that decreases means that we've got less breakdown of the DDT. And the red line is the copper guideline level that is used particularly in Canada, but is adapted in New Zealand for often agricultural land. And the worrying thing about that is that if we assume in New Zealand that DDT is broken down. Our milk is not checked for DDT anymore because we assume that the DDT is degraded. But what this shows us is if we've got high copper in soil, maybe because it's an orchard or because we've used a lot of copper fungicide, it's killed the microorganisms that would degrade the DDT, and it's still there. And so we've got to be very careful with our assumptions around what's happening with some of these contaminants. So if we're land use changing again, all right, we're selling up a land. It's an old orchard. It's an old sheep dip. It's an old market garden. We've used a lot of arsenic. We've used a lot of copper. And we assume that there's no DDT there. Well, we've got to be very careful because that assumption may not be true. So we've really got to be thinking about those land use choices. You know, selling up a sheep dip site, selling up an orchard, converting it into a kindergarten, not a good idea because we get in exposure pathways. We've got children. Children are always at highest risk of contamination turning into pollution. So we've really got to be thinking about those decisions. And the point I'm making in this slide is that responsibility for doing that or for making those decisions is not always clear. As environmental risk managers, it's our job to make sure that that decision is correct and we're putting our developments in the right place at the right time for the right outcome. We have a lot of trust in us from a scientific community. and there's a lot of power on us to do things correctly. There's a lack of understanding in New Zealand. Okay, headlines, unknown levels of contamination, arsenic found, arsenic levels too high. There's a lot of concern in New Zealand around these contaminants. I'm sure it's the same in Indonesia. And we get a lot of mis and disinformation. Okay, now I've been involved with a project in New Zealand looking at dioxin cleanup and canal sediment. And we've had people that have tried to stop the project by creating fear. Okay, this little cartoon on the right, that was delivered across the community. Okay, and the commentary there is all negative. Skull, crossbones, okay, weird stuff, spells and smells. This is all trying to detract from the credibility of the science. And that's what we often are facing when we're dealing with contaminated land. The market access issue is really important. Okay, this came out a couple of years ago. Baby spinach record for elevated levels of cadmium in California. So the trade implications, the cost implications of contamination in our food chain, if we're not making good decisions, can be really quite significant. We've seen similar things in New Zealand. Here's some data from a study I was involved with a couple of years ago, where we looked at two areas. Okay, Pukekohe, the P on the x-axis is a site called Pukekohe, and that's in the north and then near Auckland, and the G is Gisborne on the east coast. And we were looking at 3 crop plants, lettuce, spinach, and silver beet. And what's really concerning there is that if you look at Gisborne spinach, it is well above the codex value of 0.1. Now, there's huge risk there. If that product was exported, it could be rejected at the market. And that is huge reputational damage for a country like New Zealand, which is all about exporting food products. So again, we've got to be really careful in understanding how we can use the science to make good decisions. So let me finish up. All right, so what does this mean? Okay, had a bit of a mission. We've gone through some material. So what does it mean? Okay, what I'm going to tell you is that this area, and it's what you're involved with, soil conservation, remediation techniques, land reclamation, geochemistry, trace elements, environmental risk management, it is complex. And the thing is, people get scared. People are scared about their own health. They're worried about their children's health. They're worried about their incomes. They're worried about their reputation. People get scared. Here's an example of what came out. I pulled off, this is going back a number of years, but I think it's a great article. Test soil for contamination, land buyers told. Headline article, New Zealand News. If you're going to buy land, test the contamination. Who's going to interpret it? How do we get good science? How can we get good information and interpret that information so that people can be confident in what we're telling them? So if I was giving a take-home message to a New Zealand audience, this is what I would say. At this point, I'd be saying public concern over contaminated land is here to stay. How are we going to resolve it? What do we do? Well, we need science-based risk management to guide how we use land. That's what we do. I said at the start, I think we're all into environmental risk management. That's what we do. We're focusing on disturbed landscapes, and we're using soil geochemistry to understand trace elements. Our job is environmental risk management. Now, then we've got to tell the story. We've got to communicate science to industry and public. We've got to educate environmental practitioners. That's what you guys are going to be. You're the future environmental practitioners for Southeast Asia. So you need to be using the science to do your job effectively. So let me bring it back to you. All right, reflecting on that, I've given you the New Zealand perspective. Bring this back to you. Well, the challenges are the same. It's the scale that's different. The challenge you've got is that your scale in Indonesia is different, but your markets are still important, domestic and international, and people still get scared. I've been very fortunate over my time to visit contaminated land in Indonesia. So I've done a lot of work in Lombok, and I've visited a lot of areas of artisanal small-scale gold mining. And this photo always comes back to me, and I really enjoy giving it in presentations because, if you were to take an exposure pathway map and we were to go back and think about the arrows and how people are exposed and how we deal with it, this image is the classic example of exposure pathways. Because what we've got to ask ourselves, well, what's the problem? The problem is not so much the material, because this is mine waste. It's full of mercury, it's full of cyanide, it's full of all sorts of nasty stuff. The little river there is the material that's come out of a cyanide leach tank. So in all reality, all that black stuff is full of gold. But the big problem with this image is the children. There is the worst exposure pathway possible. You've got children playing on heavily contaminated soil, which defines it as polluted. All right, you've actually then got off-site movement. We've gone into the next rice paddy. You can see the liquid, it's spilled over. You do not want to be eating that rice. And in fact, we found some of the worst methyl mercury pollution I've ever seen in rice at that location. I'd love to go back to it today and then see what's going on. But we've got to think about the exposure pathways. We're not going to get rid of the contamination. What we need to do is get the kids off and then think about what is going to be a more appropriate land use around there to give the environment a chance to equilibrate. But we do that with environmental risk management. I did a quick search on Scopus yesterday. Found this paper, okay? Analysis of heavy metals and soil layers of Indonesia, spatial distribution, potential source and groundwater effect. Okay, studies report that 21 to 40% of agricultural soil in Pantura region of West Java, I don't actually know where that is contaminated with lead and cadmium. Okay, 4 to 7% of them falling into the category of heavy contamination. Right, that's going to cause people to panic. But let's not panic. Let's find it and actually work out what we do with that land. Let's stop growing food crops on it, grow fiber crops. Let's grow flowers. Let's grow timber. Let's find a way to change the exposure pathway. Because here's my take-home message for you guys. I think in the context of what we're talking about when we're thinking about disturbed landscapes is to focus on soil pollution. We need to find the pollution and we need to delineate it. Yes, it's contaminated, that's fine, but let's go for contaminated. Let's ask ourselves, so what? And let's find and delineate pollution. Because my strong belief is there's not enough money in the world to clean up all of this land. We've got a phenomenal amount of contaminated land. We are wasting money trying to clean up contaminated land that is not polluted. So we need to make evidence-based land use decisions that manage contamination. So if we can take polluted land, turn it back just into contaminated land by changing the land use and mitigating the exposure pathways, then we are succeeding in our environmental risk management. Because what our job is to do is to protect people, markets, as well as the environment. And the markets is probably the economic driving force that is going to allow us to deploy our science with regulators and achieve on what we're doing. So let's reflect on my title, all right? Based on Rennie's very kind brief, right? I came up with the idea of managing the risk of contaminants in disturbed soil in New Zealand perspective. And what I'm hoping is that you can see synergies, that you can see the relevance of that back to what you are doing in Indonesia. Because in all reality, you are the ones that are going to make the difference. As the current masters and PhD students that are going to go forth and get jobs in industry, in government, you are the future capability for risk management. And to do that properly, we need robust credible science that is going to allow people to make good decisions. And with that, terima kasih, I will finish my lecture.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. That's really impressive for us. Oh, yeah. Yeah, could you hear my voice?
Yes, yeah, I can, Rennie, yeah.
It's working. Now we are on Q&A session. We do have many students that have many questions. So who will start the question first? Where you, Mas Imam, you would like to ask your question first? Okay, please come closer to the microphone so Chris will hear your voice. Please say your name and your question. You can sit here and face this camera.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. for your presentation. I'm sorry if my English is not so good, but I will try to practice it. Sometimes my name is Astrof, and I come from Soil and Water Management program. Actually, I'm interested at environmental degradation. I want to ask you, how about in New Zealand? Because in Indonesia, there is maybe combined with modern traditional ecological knowledge with traditional and modern ecological knowledge. We mix it to fix contaminant problem. So in New Zealand is same like that, maybe mixing with traditional and modern ecological knowledge, or no, or maybe just modern traditional knowledge.
Look, that's a really good question. So in New Zealand, we call our traditional knowledge our indigenous knowledge. So in New Zealand, we have a very strong Māori culture. And what we see is that there is a strong partnership. So we do have a strong mix in New Zealand, but perhaps through a different approach. Because what we realize is that if we think about land, it's actually science-based. So our management of land is science-based. But what happens is that we're thinking about how we can use our different cultural perspectives to increase people's engagement in like protecting the land. So, you know, in a lot of New Zealand, we're moving towards not just looking at numbers for monitoring the environment. We're looking at indicators, color, you know, birds, wildlife, the restoration of species. And so what's happening is more and more in New Zealand, as we increase the partnership, we're accepting different criteria of success as part of seeing the evolution of our reclamation of land. So the means or the mechanisms that we use to reclaim the land is still science-based. It's about growing plants or managing exposure pathways or changing water or establishing wetlands. But what happens in New Zealand is that we're putting increasing value on an obligation to protect the environment, or increasing value on different qualitative indicators of success. And I think that globally is also happening. People are starting to realize that as part of a more holistic system, we'll get more people engaging in making decisions, because the value of that mixed approach is that more people will understand or engage in environmental protection.
Maybe I want to ask one more. In the part of PowerPoint, there is maybe baby spinach is from traditional knowledge or another research?
No. So baby spinach. So because what happens with baby spinach is that it's a spinach plant and it's the very young spinach plant. Because what happens, of course, is that you grow spinach and people often like the very tender spinach plant. That is actually not a native plant. That is just a commercial crop. Because in New Zealand, it's a little bit different to Indonesia. We don't have any native, well, we've got very, very few native food crops. They've been imported from Southeast Asia, from South America, from Europe. So when we think about indigenous systems or our native systems, it's more the ethics or the value or the principles behind how we care for land. That's the influence, as opposed to the crops we grow or the practices. Though very much science-based, it's that intersection with our value system that I think's seeing the biggest change.
Okay, thank you, Mr.
No, thank you. Excellent.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, there are many others questions. Please come closer to the microphone so Chris can hear your voice. First, say your name, then your question.
Hello, Professor. My name is Coda Benavides. Just have a question a little bit related to what you talked about today, but also some of your backgrounds that I had researched prior to today's meeting, specifically with phyto mining. I was really interested in just the idea. I had never heard of it before. My background is not necessarily in agriculture. So my question is just about the feasibility of implementing phyto mining in the Indonesian context, specifically areas that have either large reliance on open pit mining, specifically with heavy metals or precious metals. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Gosh, I mean, I could give a very long lecture on that subject. It's a fantastic idea, and what's really interesting right now is that phytomining is gathering a huge amount of interest. Now, phytomining is not new. It's been around since the mid-1990s, and people have been trying to make that system work commercially since then. Right now, there seems to be a bit of a turning point. You may be aware that there's a French company, Geomines, that just raised $45 million of equity capital to launch commercial nickel phytomining operations in South Africa. So that's a huge amount of capital raise. And I was an advisor to that company up until the capital raise point. Is it going to work? I don't know. I still think that the economics of nickel phytomining is very marginal because nickel's not particularly valuable. So I think, what we've got to do when we talk about phytomining is we've got to think about what are we trying to achieve from it. So if you're looking at phytomining at mine sites in Indonesia as part of a reclamation plan, then in all reality, the actual driving reason for doing it is that reclamation. And any money that comes out of it's like a bonus. Whereas if you're trying to take a technology and you're going to try and deploy it and make profit from it purely from recovering nickel, and you're going to go and clear land to plant your nickel crops, well, that's quite different. So, yeah, I don't know. I think Indonesia is really interesting, and I know that there's been a lot of really cool work looking into this at UB, and I'd love to be more involved. But I think Indonesia has a huge amount of really degraded land, which is really well suited to using nickel phytomining as that reclamation tool, but could make money. But it's complicated, finding the sites, planting the plants, managing the plants, harvesting and processing the plants is actually quite a complicated system. The other one I've been more involved with is gold phytomining. And again, at the moment, who knows? I'm potentially about to start looking at gold phytomining again, because when I did my PhD, and I kind of explored the first commercial angle for gold phytomining, the gold price was $300 an ounce. Today, it's over $4,000 an ounce. And so that would change the potential economic engine for that technology. And right now, there's a huge amount of interest in that internationally. So phytomining is hot property right now. There are 3 companies trying to commercialize nickel phytomining: Genomines, Metal Plant, and EcoNick. They're all based in Europe. And there is one company out there that is playing around with gold phytomining commercially. I'm just kind of looking at how I might be involved with it. So watch what happens. It'll be really interesting.
Okay, that's all.
Yep.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
okay. Another question? Yeah. Yeah. Kalau di pertanyaannya juga nggak apa-apa.
Okay, thank you for the time. Yeah. My name is Ahmad Rafli Pambudi. You can address me Rafli, sir. I want to ask, I'm interested in the explanation regarding heavy metals and microplastic contamination in agricultural land that use organic fertilizer, especially compost. How can this happen, and what the management action can be taken? And could it be that the safety of organic fruit or vegetables, organic labels, which have always been considered safe, or it is actually questionable? Thank you, sir.
Oh, look, that's a really good question. And to be honest, I don't have the answer because I don't think we know. But I think what you've just described is becoming an emerging real problem. We are realizing that organic wastes that are turned into organic composts are full of microplastics. We know that's going into soil that's supposedly clean. What we don't really know is that abundance, and we have no idea what the transfer of those microplastics looks like. We don't know what the impact of those microplastics is on other contaminants. There's a lot of research looking at the role of microplastics in cadmium and arsenic availability, but we also don't know what those microplastics do to soil microorganisms and to macrofauna like earthworms. So the reason I mention it is an emerging contaminant. And I think when we start looking for microplastics, we tend to find them. So again, we have to be very careful. Okay, so we've found microplastic contamination. We've got to ask ourselves, so what? Is it causing harm? And we don't have the science to be able to answer that. Is it transferring into food? There is indication that yes, it is. Is that causing harm? We don't know. So I think, it puts us at a really interesting point, because as soil scientists and in water science, we're at that interface between looking at the food and how it's grown. And we've got a responsibility to do the research to look at that transfer pathway. So I think that's an opportunity for you guys. Actually analyzing microplastics is a little bit tricky, but once you've got your head around it, it's quite possible. And so we've got to start looking at it. We've got to design experiments and start mapping the abundance of microplastics in the horticultural soils around Malang. How much is there? Only then can we start to see what the problem really is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Another question? Okay. Yes, Mas Yudi.
Yeah, thank you, Prof, for the amazing presentation. My name is Jorona. I'm interested in the Palmerston North City. We know there is a contaminate in the heavy metal, especially on PB in the residential area. And several of the residential area has a high level of the PB, almost 25%. So I will ask about the regulation in the residential area from the contamination of the heavy metal, and does the condition impact the valuation of land and especially of economical valuation, like for the rent or sell again in this area. Maybe it can insight for the regulation can adapt it in Indonesia too. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. That's really high level, and that I think confirms what we see in urban areas. The impact of contamination on land values is a big challenge, and it's one of the reasons, especially in New Zealand, why people don't really like to look and find contamination. And then when they do find contamination, they worry about who they tell. Interestingly, when we look at lead in soil, there's quite a lot of ethical approvals we have to go through because, of course, that information is problematic. It comes down to a duty of care. So if you do a study and you find that in a residential area you have very, very high lead levels, there is almost a duty of care to disclose that to residents so that they're informed. Because, that sort of lead level you were talking about could really be harming children's development. So that's why it comes again down to thinking about how you use that land. So, let's say you've got a building complex and you do some sampling and you find there's an area of soil that's very high in lead. It's really not going to be feasible to dig that soil up and take it away. What you've got to do is think about what you can do with that. And instead, you could fence it off and plant it in trees. Because the big problem with that soil is if children are playing with it. Because lead's quite unique in the sense of it doesn't get into plants. It blows around, so dust is an exposure pathway, and then just touching and then ingesting. So children touching soil and licking hands, that's the problem. So it comes down to those exposure pathways. So I think the duty of care is that if we as scientists find that sort of contamination, what we need to be doing is having a strong thought about the exposure pathways and changing how that land is used to mitigate them. And that can be as simple as fencing it off, planting it up, and keeping children out. Or maybe you put a car park over the top of it. One of the best ways to deal with contaminated land is to put concrete on it and turn it into a car park, because that stops the exposure pathways. It's an interesting comment you make around should there be a reduction in rent, or how does that affect that? I think that's a politician's job. I think as scientists, what we've got to do is to if we see risk, let's not try and put an economic cost on that risk. We've just got to mitigate the risk. So I think what we need to do is use our science to come up with solutions which will stop the risk. Then, of course, there's a health issue because those people in that area are possibly already suffering from lead poisoning. They need to get medical help. That then becomes a government or a health system problem. That is not our risk management problem. So I think this is why it draws on what I was saying. It is complex and it's scary. And once we start looking at these things, we've got to be ready to give very clear guidance on what should be done. Excellent thinking.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Maybe it's still take home risk and take home task for the regulation in any country to we can get the healthy life, clean water and clean air, so we can get a good generation for the children. Thank you,
Yeah.
Prof.
Yeah.
Chris, we still have plenty questions. So is
Cool.
it okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here we are.
Okay, thank you for the time, Prof. So my name is Cindy, and I think the situation in Indonesia is worse than in New Zealand. In the class, we have a lot of discussion about remediation, reclamation, and conservation. But the question is, should we conservation the nature, or we should conservation the human? Because I think the problem lies with the human.
Whether to do prevention for human exposure or conserve nature.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I understand that. No, very, very good question. At the end of the day, we are the ultimate risk receptor. At the end of the day, it comes down to people. Okay, so we think about, you've got to ask yourself, why are we interested in conservation? Because conservation of our natural environment has a benefit to us as people living in the environment. So, you know, this whole debate about should we be conserving parts of the environment really comes down to the value that we place on the environment for our own prosperity, etc. So I think they are tied together. At the end of the day, it's us as a human that's the top of the exposure pathway chain. We've got to look at our environment, but then we've got to start being very clever about making decisions of how we use it. Okay, we've got to preserve areas that are not damaged and then be more efficient in using other areas that are already degraded. So it becomes this situation of identifying prime land or, you know, virgin land that we can conserve. And I think that's a very important part of it. But then it's looking at other land and recognizing that there's contamination, but not panicking about it, realizing that it's contamination that's only a problem under certain land uses. So we're kind of thinking about our environment and we're going, okay, well, that land is good for food. That land over there, well, it's actually not good for food, but let's grow flowers or forestry on it. Let's use that more effectively, still for production, but safe production. And then let's really optimize and be efficient on how we use that land there and there so that this other land we can conserve. So I think it's a really important subject for you to discuss in class. It's understanding the relative value proposition that goes with different parcels of land and getting people to engage in decision making around what they want to do with that land. And that's where the remediation and conservation side comes in. Okay, there may be land that people recognize as polluted and they really want it to be restored back to a conservation state. Hey, let's do that. If that's what people want, because that has the primary economic value, let's do it. But I think we've got to think about it more holistically in the sense of we have to grow food, we have to have economic productivity, and we live within that environment. And you've got to have confidence to be able to lead people along those conversations because we can't make the decisions for them.
Okay. Another question? Say your name and your question.
I have a question that I'm translating as well, so give me a moment. My question, hello, I'm Benjamin. My question is about maybe some more of the constraints with regards to changing land use in Indonesia. So, for instance, the picture that you showed of the children playing on the post-mining, is that a situation where you just have to abandon the land?
because, you know, with, especially on Java, there being so much, limited land for people that rely on that kind of for their income source. They rely on that for, their food sources. Are there ways to clean or manage that contamination in a way that they would still be able to, say, grow rice or grow these things? Or is it a situation where it's like you have to change to a different use or just abandon it? That's my question. So
Yeah, no, really cool. So, I mean, it's an extreme example. I mean, my perspective is that you should never grow food on land that has received pollution, basically. So we could put it into the pollution word. This was waste that came out of a mining operation. It is clearly nasty. It is clearly polluted because the contaminants within it will cause unacceptable risk. And so we need to identify that land and then go, right, we can't grow food on it. Because I think, yes, in Java, there's an issue with land. But I think the thing about Java, like anywhere in the world, it's how we use the land. There's actually a lot of land. It's just we've got to be more clever with how we do it. And instead of trying to grow food crops on land which really doesn't support food crops and getting really poor yields of poor quality food, we've got to be saying, all right, here is our prime land. Let's focus on protecting it from pollution and then actually operate well, which then releases us to other land, which we might decide has got contamination that it would be polluted from a food crop perspective, but let's grow a fiber crop. Let's grow oils on it. Let's grow flowers. I often say one of the great things you can do on contaminated land is grow flowers because you don't eat them. Okay, so you've got to think about things more holistically and have a look at a system and go, well, what do we need to use land for? And then go, right, well, let's carve up our area and use it appropriately. The other issue with that image, it's also about waste management. So when we think about contamination in mining areas, it's actually about where we put the stuff. And that artisanal small-scale gold mining, essentially what they do is that once they've finished the operation, they just throw stuff away. There's no thought to where that goes. And in all reality, one of the things I want to do, and I've been slowly working away at it, is that waste is the perfect environment for maybe gold phytomining, because you've still got gold in the material. You plan it as part of your operation. You go in there, you do gold phytomining, you make some money out of it. And over the period of time where you're harvesting gold, you're starting to put organic matter back. You're starting to stabilize it. The kids are off it. And by the time we've finished the gold phytomining operation, then you can just put it back into forestry. So it's a land use decision. And then we bring phytoremediation, we bring phytomining, we bring food production into it as part of a holistic system. So you've got the different layers and levels, but I think it requires us to have that open thought about basically ecological design. How do we want to use land more effectively?
yeah. Thank you.
Cool.
That's,
No, you're welcome.
yeah. Is there,
Other question?
yeah, that'd be that's right. Okay.
Another question.
Hey, Benjamin, can I just ask, are you a visiting student?
I am a resident student here, but I am from US. So
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So it's Koda who asked the question earlier.
Yeah, no, exactly. I was just saying, hang on, there's two US accents in Malang. That's a bit different.
You're right.
They can speak Indonesia.
You do much better than me.
Yeah. So this is a question about the natural causes of heavy metal contamination. You gave an example with like the mountain. Other examples that you can give about how heavy metals, there can be heavy metal contamination both
well, from natural processes, but both in a sense of it's actually a pollution problem and it's just a contamination problem. He would like just some more explanation about that.
So the point of that discussion is to go back to, again, this whole thing of land use. So you'll have areas of Indonesia which are geothermal or volcanic, where you've got elevated levels of mercury, arsenic in the soil. And so you look at that land, and if you think about it from trying to grow food on it, it's just really not suitable. So it comes down to, again, looking at that land and going, well, this is long-term geogenic contamination from natural processes. It's just not soil that is suited to growing food crops, because our food crops have been bred to grow in certain environments. Yet those same environments will have a unique flora. And so what we've done over history is we've seen, oh, there's land, let's clear it and let's plant it in what we know. But that's really not that appropriate. And it comes down to why we end up getting really poor yields of low quality food on soil. It's because we shouldn't be growing it there. Now, the nickel example is what we see the most worldwide. Large parts of Indonesia have got ultramafic soils, which are the same thing. Communities are trying to grow wheat or soybeans on that soil. They don't grow. And that's where the whole nickel phytomining comes in, because one of the ideas there is to say, well, let's stop growing food crops. Let's grow metal. Let's sell the metal. And then that's income to buy food from somewhere else. But then we've got to find where that somewhere else is, where we can put the investment into to grow more high yielding food. Another example is cadmium and lead. There are large parts of Europe which are called calamine soils, which have high levels of cadmium, lead, and zinc. And that's just naturally because of geological formations. If you try and grow wheat on it, you're going to get poor yield, and you're perhaps going to get transfer into the food chain. It's because that land is not suitable for our modern food systems. So that's the recurring theme sort of I've come through with today, is that just thinking about, look at land. Yes, it's polluted if we're trying to grow food on it because the zinc's going into plants and people are getting an unacceptable level of zinc. But the easiest way to fix that is to stop growing food and grow something else, because that gets rid of the exposure pathway. And if you can stop the exposure pathway, then you're managing that contamination in a safe way.
Okay, for attendee who joining us online, do you have any question? You can ask your question by writing your question through chat box or by directly raising your hand using a raise hand menu. Still any question? Okay, please come closer. From here. Your lecture really interesting. That's why all our students have questions.
Yeah, no, and they were fantastic questions as well.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, sir. My name is Alvin Safitri. You can call me Alvin. I want to ask for you. Maybe can you explain if agricultural land is not subject to the National Environmental Standard or NES, doesn't this create a regulatory gap where persistent chemical like DDT could remain undirected and continue to pose risk food safety?
You are right. It creates a gap, and I think that's one of the themes I've said. But there is a logic to that gap. Okay, so in New Zealand, what controls contamination in agricultural land is food testing. Because what happens if we harvest food from land and we test it and we find contamination, and that leads to a trade response or a market response, then there's a consequence for that land. And what any operator would do would be to resolve the problem, maybe by cleaning it up or by stopping growing food production on it. So again, by default, what happens through the food testing is that the contamination is identified and then the exposure pathway is mitigated. So the argument in New Zealand is that that agricultural land is kept safe, or the exposure pathways are managed because of the food checking. What happens is that when you transfer it from agricultural land into a development, well, then there's no ongoing checking of food, because no one ever goes and samples every year your garden to make sure it's safe. There's no like certification, annual certification of an urban property. So what happens there is that we go to a situation of the land is checked before it transfers ownership to make sure that it's going to be safe going forward. And that's the delineation. So it does create a gap, but the logic is that in New Zealand, with so much agricultural land and so much change of contamination state of agricultural land, it would be impractical to be testing agricultural land in a formal sense on a regular basis. Instead, we test the food. And if the food is found to be problematic, that instantly can tie back to land, and we have to deal with the land. So it's a practicality point of view. It's just thinking about what is going to be the best way to implement a process to manage that risk.
Okay, thank you for the answer, sir. So the second question, can risk-based approach like those that you explained used in New Zealand can be adapted to Indonesian socio-economic context?
I mean, I would say a short answer, yes, because I think what we're talking about is land, exposure, objective scientific information, and then decision making. So I would like to think absolutely yes. You know, the context is different. We've got a small population. We've got a fairly good regulatory system. I mean, New Zealand's been a developed country for a very long time. So there are different socio-economic constraints on it. But I think this is, again, you know, why I'm delighted to be able to give this lecture today, because that adaptation of what we can do globally, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Europe, all of these places where Indonesia has market engagement, you can learn from what other countries are doing to come up with a system that works for Indonesia. And it's you guys that are going to do that. That's why you are doing your postgraduate programs, to gain the knowledge and the confidence and the experience, so that when you are working for the Indonesian government or for private sector, you can actually support that decision making. Maybe you're working in the education or the university research sector to actually influence policy. That's what I think you guys can do, and learn from these sorts of exposures to make better decisions.
Okay, thank you, sir. Another question? Imam, sudah. Oh, sudah. Okay, sama. Another last question, please.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Chris Anderson, for your sharing the material. So my name is Novandi Rizky Prastia. I'm from a PhD student from Brawijaya University, and I'm so interested about research, how to environmental risk management. So my question is, what knowledge gaps do you think are most critical for us to address in Indonesia, so that our locally developed solution in Indonesia can be more effective and evidence-based? I think it last question for us.
Okay, no, well, that's a really big question. So knowledge gaps. I mean, so you've got to realize that I'm basing that on my own experiences of being in Indonesia, because of course I don't know the system as well as you guys do. I mean, I think it's a relatively simple answer, though. It's just a lack of kind of resolution on the distribution of contamination and then quantification of exposure pathways. Because this whole idea we've been talking about thinking about the exposure pathways and then making good decisions about how we use land to keep people safe, because that's really what this is about, keeping people safe, either through direct exposure or through food, or through the ecosystem service. But to be able to do that, we've got to be able to actually know what's in our soil. And that's a global problem, because testing soils and getting robust quality data that people can make decisions on is expensive. And then having the system whereby people can make decisions that then leads to policy is again complicated. So the answer is quite simple. We need more data, and we need qualified, respected people to interpret that data and then affect decision making. And that's the gap. But again, that's what you guys can do. That's why you've got the opportunity going forward. I mean, Indonesia is trying massive things. I mean, I'm loosely involved on the side with looking at some work in East Indonesia to support production for the school meals program that your president is, continuing to push. And that's a hugely aspirational program to have school children across Indonesia have a nutritious meal a day. It's fantastic, but that requires food and it requires land to grow the food. Okay, so I bet you no one's even thought about testing, things like metal contamination from different parts to see it through. So it's really quite complicated. So you guys have got to go forward and you've got to be asking the questions and looking for the data, making those requests, getting behind the politicians to actually keep making sure we've got good information to make good decisions. But that's a global problem. That is not just an Indonesian knowledge gap. That is a knowledge gap for the world. And we need more people that can drive a solution.
Okay, thank you for this understanding.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Okay, that's all question from our student. Is there any question from audience who joining us online? If no, we will stop this guest lecture. Thank you very much, and especially for your lecture, that's really increase our knowledge related to soil contamination and pollution. Whether study case in New Zealand, also according to this experience in Indonesia too. On behalf of the master program in soil and water management, Faculty of Agriculture, Universitas Brawijaya, we extend our deepest gratitude to Professor Anderson for sharing his valuable expertise with us today. I would like also thank you to all the attendees, whether joining us online or in person in this room. We hope this lecture has enriched our knowledge and inspired further research and collaboration. That's all. Thank you very much and see you again in another chance, whether in guest lecture, international conference, online, or Chris come to Indonesia. Before closing this lecture, I would like to ask for documentation, taking picture together. Attendee who join us online, could you please open your camera for all students? Mas Ando, tolong bantu capture. Okay. Please, your brightest smile. Okay. Smile. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Another one. Maybe with Melesat pose. Brawijaya has a pose like this, Chris.
Okay.
Our hand like this. Yeah.
So
it's like airplane take off because we want to gain more prestation.
okay. Excellent.
Okay. 1, 2. Okay, thank you very much and see you again in another chance. Good
Fantastic.
afternoon for Chris in New Zealand and good morning in Indonesia. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you
Terima
again.
kasih.